Title: The Song and Dance Man, The Return. Chapter 1: A Dark Melody. Eldermere had always been a place where time seemed to bend, where the fog rolled in thick and heavy like a tangible weight pressing down on the soul. The air was damp, the earth cold beneath the soles of your shoes, and the trees, those ancient gnarled oaks, stood like silent sentinels, watching over the town. The sky was perpetually overcast, a pale grey that filtered through the thick, oppressive clouds, casting everything in an unnatural dimness. For years, Eldermere had been nothing more than a quiet speck on the map, its residents living their lives in the shadows of its haunted past, their homes and hearts weathered by time. But tonight, the air felt different. There was something electric, something unsettled in the very air itself. The town stirred uneasily as the anniversary of the fair approached. Emma stood at the edge of the fairground, watching as the festival preparations took place. The workers were setting up the carnival rides, bright garish colours that stood in stark contrast to the town's usual muted shades. But despite the festivity, the place felt off, hollow. The decorations seemed out of place, as if they were an insult to the memory of something darker, something better left forgotten. The fair had always been a part of Eldermere's tradition. Every year, for as long as anyone could remember, the people had gathered to celebrate. The stalls, the games, the music. It was meant to bring joy, to bring the community together. But that was before he came. Emma had heard the stories. As a child, she had sat wide-eyed at her grandmother's knee, listening to the warnings. The Song and Dance Man, a name whispered in fear and reverence, a man who appeared out of nowhere, dressed in tattered clothes and a mask that obscured his face, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He would appear on the night of the fair, and his music, oh that music, would draw the children in, one by one. It wasn't long before they started to disappear, vanishing into thin air, as if they had never existed. The stories had always been there, haunting the edges of her childhood. She'd never believed them, of course. Who would? After all, Eldermere was a place where rumours and superstitions thrived. But as Emma grew older, she began to hear more and more about the man in the mask. The whispers weren't just stories anymore. They were warnings. Tonight, the fog rolled in thick and slow, hanging heavy over the fairground like a veil. The carnival workers continued their tasks, unaware of the dread creeping through the air, unaware of the old town's curse that had yet to be broken. Emma didn't know why she felt so drawn to the place, why her pulse quickened as she stepped closer to the fairground's gates, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting. Her grandmother had often told her to stay away, to never go near the man with the mask, but Emma's curiosity was a force she could never resist. Tonight, she had come to see for herself. She had to know if the stories were true. "Are you sure you want to go in there, girl?" a voice called out from behind her. Emma turned to see Olivia, a woman who had lived in Eldermere her entire life. She was tall, with long grey hair and eyes that seemed to see through you. There was something about Olivia that always unsettled Emma, as if she knew too much, like she carried the weight of all the town's secrets. And tonight, Olivia's gaze was intense, piercing. "I'm fine," Emma replied, her voice more confident than she felt. "I'm just curious." Olivia didn't say anything for a moment, her lips pressed together in a thin line, as if she were considering something. Finally she spoke, her voice low, her words careful. "Curiosity is dangerous in Eldermere, child. It's not a place for the faint of heart, and it's certainly not a place for anyone to go looking for trouble." Emma laughed nervously, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "I'm not looking for trouble, Olivia. I just want to see what the fair looks like this year." Olivia's eyes narrowed. "And you think the fair is the same as it was before?" She shook her head slowly, almost as if speaking to herself. "Things change. Things come back." Emma's smile faltered. Olivia's words struck a chord deep within her, though she didn't want to admit it. She had always been drawn to the idea of uncovering the truth behind the mysterious man in the mask. It had always felt like a story, a myth, something people told to scare children. But deep down, there had always been a flicker of doubt, a gnawing feeling that maybe, just maybe, the stories weren't as far-fetched as they seemed. Before she could respond, Olivia's eyes softened, and she placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. "If you must go, she said softly. Be careful. The man isn't what you think. The music, the dance, it's all part of a bigger picture, something you don't want to understand. Trust me. Emma didn't know how to respond. Instead, she simply nodded and walked past Olivia, towards the fairground. Olivia's warning echoed in her mind, but Emma ignored it. She would see for herself. She would find out the truth. As she stepped through the gates of the fairground, the air seemed to shift. The temperature dropped slightly, the sound of distant laughter and chatter becoming muffled. As if the world around her had grown quieter, the fog swirled in thick coils, and the lights of the carnival rides flickered strangely, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. For a moment, Emma almost felt as though she had crossed over into another world, one where time didn't exist, and the past was alive and watching her. She walked deeper into the fairground, her heart pounding with both excitement and unease. The sound of a distant melody reached her ears, a soft, lilting tune that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was haunting, hypnotic, too beautiful for words. She followed the sound, her feet moving almost of their own accord. There, in the center of the fairground, stood the tent. It was old, tattered, its once bright colors faded and worn. The entrance flapped in the breeze, revealing only shadows within. The air around it was still, but the music grew louder, more insistent. The melody filled the air, drowning out everything else, pulling Emma closer. She couldn't resist. As she stepped into the tent, the world outside vanished. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old wood, the dim light from the flickering lanterns casting long, ghostly shadows across the ground. In the center of the room, the man stood. He was tall, slender, draped in tattered black clothing. His face was obscured by a mask, white, smooth, and featureless, except for two glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. His body swayed slightly to the music, as if the tune controlled him, as if it had a life of its own. The children were already there, gathered in a circle around him. Their eyes were empty, their bodies stiff, as though they were trapped in the music's spell. And the man, the song and dance man, was leading them, his every movement precise, graceful, and unnatural. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The stories were true. Chapter 2. The dance begins. The sounds of the fairground outside the tent were distant now, drowned out by the insistent, haunting melody that seemed to echo from every corner of the dimly lit space. Emma stood frozen, her heart thudding in her chest, her breath shallow. The song and dance man, the figure of local legend, swayed in the center of the room, the flickering lanterns casting long shadows across his tall, gaunt frame. The air around him shimmered with an unnatural energy, as if reality itself was bending to the rhythm of the music. The children stood in a perfect circle, their faces pale and their eyes distant. They moved not of their own will, but as though they were marionettes, strings pulled taut by some invisible force. Their feet shifted in time with the melody, their bodies rigid, yet somehow fluid, as though they were one with the music itself. Their lips did not move, but their faces were empty of expression, hollow shells of the children they once were. Emma's breath hitched, her body trembling with both fear and fascination. She had heard the stories, of course, the whispered warnings about the song and dance man, who came to the fair every year, drawing children to him with his strange, otherworldly music. But to see it with her own eyes, to witness the hypnotic sway of the man and the children caught in his spell, was something entirely different. She stepped forward, her feet moving without thought, drawn toward the center of the room, as if the music had taken root in her very bones. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure in the center, his mask gleaming pale in the soft light of the lanterns. The darkness in the corners of the tent seemed to pulse and writhe, as if it were alive, waiting for something or someone. The song and dance man's hands moved, slow and deliberate, his fingers weaving through the air as though conducting an orchestra that only he could hear. The music grew louder, more insistent, more urgent. It was a song unlike any Emma had ever heard, a melody both beautiful and terrifying, its notes twisted and haunting, evoking a deep, primal sense of longing. It spoke of something ancient, something lost, and it stirred something inside her, something she didn't understand. Why are they doing this? Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising swell of the music. Her feet felt heavy, as though they were sinking into the ground. She could feel the weight of the tent pressing down on her, the air growing thick with an oppressive force. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, reaching toward her like dark, greedy hands. One of the children, Emma recognized her as Sophie, a girl from the village, suddenly turned her head, her eyes locking onto Emma's. For a moment, the fog of indifference seemed to clear from Sophie's gaze, and a flicker of recognition flashed in her eyes. It was brief, but it was enough to send a chill down Emma's spine. Sophie's mouth moved slightly, but no sound emerged. Her lips were dry, cracked, as though she had not spoken in days, or perhaps years. She raised one trembling hand and pointed toward the exit, her expression pleading. A silent scream seemed to hang in the air between them, one that Emma could feel deep in her bones. Emma's heart raced, her instincts screaming at her to run, to get out of the tent, but she couldn't move. It was as though her body was frozen in place, held captive by the music, by the power of the man at the center of the room. The song and dance man turned his head slowly, his glowing eyes fixing on Emma with an intensity that made her blood run cold. He smiled then, though it was not a smile that could bring comfort. It was a smile that twisted and contorted his face, as though his very being was something that should not exist. His voice, when it came, was low and musical, though it seemed to come from all around her, echoing inside her mind. "You've come to watch the dance, haven't you, my dear?" Emma's breath caught in her throat. The words seemed to reverberate in her skull, vibrating through her very soul. She couldn't speak. She couldn't move. The music grew louder, its dissonant chords clawing at her sanity, at her very will. He raised his hand again, the music slowing, and the children froze in place, their eyes vacant once more. He took a step forward, his movements fluid, predatory. "You should have stayed away, child. This place, it calls to you, doesn't it? The music, the dance." Emma's voice finally returned to her, though it came out as a strangled whisper. What is this? What are you doing to them?" The song and dance man's eyes gleamed with something ancient, something darker than the very night itself. He tilted his head slightly, as though considering her question. "They are not so different from you, my dear. They are merely listening to the call. The dance must be completed. All must dance. All must be part of the song." His words were like a riddle, an enigma wrapped in the depths of the night. Emma's pulse thundered in her ears as the reality of what was happening sank in. The children weren't just dancing. They were trapped, bound by the music, by the power of the song and dance man. They were no longer themselves. They were something else, something lost. The fog outside the tent seemed to grow thicker, creeping in through the seams of the canvas. Emma could feel it, thick and damp against her skin, the air growing colder by the second. It pressed in on her, suffocating her, until she felt as though the very walls of the tent were closing in. The man moved again, gliding toward the nearest child, Sophie, his steps soundless on the ground. Sophie's body twitched, a slight jerk, as though reacting to some unseen force. The song and dance man extended a hand, his fingers long and unnaturally slender. His touch brushed against Sophie's cheek, and Emma gasped as the girl's face contorted in pain, her eyes rolling back in her head. The music stopped, abruptly, a single note hanging in the air, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Sophie's body fell limp to the ground, her limbs twisted in a grotesque parody of life. The other children followed suit, their movements jerking violently before they collapsed in unison, their faces contorted in silent agony. Emma stumbled backward, her hands pressed to her ears, trying to block out the oppressive silence that followed. The world felt too still, too heavy. The man's gaze turned back to her, his smile widening, his mask gleaming eerily in the faint light. "It is not over," he said softly, his voice a cold whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "The dance will never end." Chapter 2. The dance begins. And the air in the tent grew dense and suffocating, the temperature dropping so sharply that Emma could see her breath fogging in the dim light. The lanterns, once casting a warm glow, now flickered erratically, as though struggling against some unseen force. A cold draught stirred the edges of the tent, and the music, continued, relentless, its discordant notes ringing in her ears. It felt like something ancient, something malevolent, weaving a spell that held them all in its grip. Sophie's eyes locked onto Emma's with that fleeting moment of clarity, her mouth moving as if trying to speak. But no words came. It was as if Sophie's very soul had been severed from her body, trapped in the ritual, and yet a piece of her still fought, still reached out to Emma. That brief connection, the desperation in Sophie's gaze, made Emma's heart race. But before Emma could move, the music surged once more, the haunting melody enveloping her, and Sophie's eyes went blank again, returning to their glassy, lifeless state. Emma's pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out the music for a split second. What was happening? She wanted to scream, wanted to pull the children out of this trance, but her body refused to obey. It felt as though her very will was being bent to the rhythm of the tune. The song and dance man swayed gently, his face still concealed behind that polished mask. An unearthly thing with no features, only smooth, unsettling contours. His body moved fluidly, as though he were not a man at all, but something that had no earthly limits, something born of shadow and sound. Every movement seemed deliberate, an orchestrated dance, his fingers splayed as if conducting the very fabric of reality itself. Emma's limbs felt heavy, as though they were sinking into the wooden floor, anchored by the growing weight of the music. Her eyes refused to leave the man, but her mind screamed for her to look away, to break free from the pull of his gaze. I have to do something. The thought was clear, urgent, but her body betrayed her, forcing her to remain, locked in place by the hypnotic rhythm. The lanterns flickered again, casting wild shadows across the tent. One by one they blinked out, plunging the room into darkness. Only the faintest glimmer of moonlight from a crack in the canvas illuminated the children's forms. Emma felt a tightness in her chest, as the world around her seemed to grow smaller, more claustrophobic. The music grew louder still, the notes scraping against her sanity. With the last flicker of light, a shape moved in the darkness. At first, Emma thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her, but then it came into sharper focus. A shadow, deeper than the rest, twisted and writhed at the edge of the tent. It was no longer a part of the tent's architecture, no mere shadow, but something with shape and substance, something alive. The air grew colder still as the shadow slithered toward Emma, its presence oppressive, tangible. Emma's breath hitched, and she finally broke the trance, stumbling backward, her eyes darting between the children, the shadow, and the song and dance man. Her gaze snapped back to the man at the center of the circle. His eyes were glowing faintly, burning with an unholy fire that sent an icy shiver down her spine. He smiled again, a slow, deliberate motion that stretched across his face, though it was not a smile born of any emotion she could recognize. It was twisted, distorted, as if he were savoring some dark pleasure. "You cannot leave," he said, his voice a soft melody that sent chills down her spine. "The dance is eternal. You are already part of it. All of you." Emma took a step back, her legs trembling beneath her. She wanted to scream, to fight, but every instinct in her told her that such a thing was futile. She could feel the music in her bones, in the very marrow of her being. It had already started to take root, already begun to pull at her like a string in the hands of a puppeteer. Her body wanted to move, to join the others, to dance. The shadow, no longer just a silhouette, materialized fully now, a creature of darkness, its form constantly shifting, fluid. Its eyes glinted red, burning with a hunger that Emma could feel in her chest, a primal fear gnawing at her heart. It was a part of him, a part of them. Her head spun, and for a moment, the world tilted. The air itself felt wrong, thick and oppressive, like being trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The tent seemed to stretch impossibly, the walls expanding outward as though the very fabric of reality was being pulled apart. "Who are you?" Emma managed to whisper, her voice thin and desperate, cracking in the stillness. She struggled to push the words past the lump in her throat, though her mind was spinning, drowning in the strange rhythm of the music. The song and dance man did not answer immediately. He continued to sway, his body twisting and turning as though he were caught in an eternal waltz, one that only he knew the steps to. The shadow slithered closer to Emma, its tendrils reaching out to caress her legs, her arms. It felt cold, unnatural, like something that should not exist. "You will learn," he said finally. "In time, you will understand." And then, the dance began again. The children, once still and lifeless, began to move once more. Their bodies jerked, twitching as they resumed their synchronized motions, their steps fluid, but mechanical, their eyes dead and empty, pupils wide and unseeing. Sophie's body jerked violently, her arms outstretched, as though trying to reach for something just out of her grasp. The song and dance man raised his hand, fingers poised as if directing an invisible orchestra. He gestured toward Emma, and though she tried to resist, tried to move away, she felt herself drawn in, pulled toward him as if caught in an unseen current. Her body obeyed, her limbs moving of their own volition. Her feet took one step, then another, and though she screamed inside her mind, her mouth remained silent. The music swelled, louder now, and she could feel it in her chest, in her bones. The rhythm, hypnotic and maddening, thrummed through her like blood, like life itself. The shadow at her feet twisted and coiled around her ankles, its tendrils binding her, holding her in place. Emma cried out silently as she struggled to break free, but the harder she fought, the more the music took hold. The walls of the tent closed in around her, and the darkness, thick as tar, seeped into her mind, erasing her thoughts, her fears. All that mattered was the song. "Don't fight it," the song and dance man's voice whispered again, soft as velvet but laced with poison. "You are already part of the dance. You have always been." The children moved, in perfect harmony, their steps synchronized with his every movement. They danced, and the shadows danced with them, a macabre performance that had no end. Emma's limbs felt like they were no longer her own, and as she twirled into the circle, she realized with a sickening certainty that she was not just watching the dance, she was part of it now. Her body moved against her will, and the shadows, the darkness, they were all closing in, drowning her in the rhythm, in the music. Forever. Chapter 3. The Dance of the Damned. Emma could feel the pulse of the music deep within her, reverberating in the very marrow of her bones. The melody, once haunting, now had a sickening quality, as though the notes were worms gnawing at her thoughts, writhing inside her skull. She wanted to scream, wanted to cry out, but her mouth, her body, none of it obeyed her commands. She was a puppet, a marionette controlled by the invisible strings of that cursed tune. Her limbs moved without her will, her feet following the rhythm, the pattern that had been etched into her soul by the relentless looping melody. Her eyes were locked on the others, on the children, their faces frozen in expressions of vacant submission. Sophie's form twitched, her eyes wide and unseeing, while the others moved as though they were born to this, born to dance under the gaze of the shadowed man who controlled it all. The song and dance man was still at the center, his presence overwhelming, as though the very air around him bent and quivered under his will. His masked face, featureless and smooth, seemed to shift with every step, as though it was not truly there at all, an illusion, a veil of darkness drawn across the emptiness that he was. Emma's body jerked violently, as though caught in an invisible storm. She wanted to stop, wanted to break free, but the moment she tried, the music intensified, the rhythm sweeping her back into line. She could feel the eyes of the song and dance man upon her, even without seeing his gaze. It was as if the very essence of him was watching, pulling her deeper into the dance. The tent around her seemed to distort, its walls bending in and out of focus, as though the fabric of reality itself was being stretched by the beat of the song. The shadows lengthened, twisting and spiraling, until they became creatures of their own. Emma's heart raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the world around her spun. And then, the air changed. It grew thick and heavy, suffocating, like a cloud of smoke closing in on her chest. She gasped for breath, but it was as if the oxygen had been sucked from the tent, leaving only the oppressive weight of the dance. The music, always present, always twisting its way into her mind, was now louder than ever, a deafening crescendo that made her feel as if her very thoughts were being drowned. She looked at the other children again. Their faces were devoid of emotion, empty vessels moving only as they were told. But now, as Emma's vision blurred, she saw something more, something behind their eyes, a darkness that was not theirs, but that had taken residence in their souls. Something inhuman, something that had devoured them. No, she shook her head, trying to break the spell. This can't be happening, but it was. The darkness was real. It was swallowing them one by one. And now, it was coming for her. She could feel it crawling up her spine, a chill that ran like ice through her veins. It wasn't just the song anymore. The shadows themselves seemed to be alive, writhing, stretching toward her, clawing at her with cold, invisible fingers. The children's movements became more frenzied. Their limbs jerked, their eyes blank. But there was a certain urgency now in their dance, a desperation that had not been there before. They were not just dancing. They were being forced to dance, and the longer they moved, the more they lost of themselves. Emma could see it now. Their souls were being siphoned away, drained with each step, each turn, until there was nothing left but empty, hollow husks of children, slaves to the rhythm, slaves to the song and dance man. A sharp pain shot through Emma's chest, and she gasped, stumbling backward. Her feet caught on the edge of the circle, and she nearly fell. But the moment she broke her rhythm, the music screamed louder, a discordant wail that scraped at her eardrums, nearly sending her into convulsions. She clutched her head, her thoughts spinning in a whirlwind of confusion and terror. She tried to move away, to escape, but the shadows had encircled her, and the music, oh God, the music was pulling her back, wrapping around her like a shroud. The song and dance man moved toward her, his form fluid, his movements graceful but predatory. "You cannot escape," he said, his voice low and soothing, like a lullaby sung to a child. But the words held a venomous edge, a promise of doom. "You are already mine, Emma." Her breath quickened, her pulse pounding in her ears. "No," she thought desperately, "I will not succumb. I will not be like them." But it was hopeless. Her body was no longer her own. The rhythm, the dance had consumed her, just as it had consumed Sophie, just as it had consumed the others. There was no fighting it, no resisting it. She felt herself being pulled into the circle, her feet dragging, her legs too weak to stand against the force of the music. A cold, clammy hand gripped her wrist, and she flinched. But when she looked down, no one was there. The shadow had touched her, reaching out from the darkness. It wasn't a hand at all, but a tendril, a living thing, dark and formless. She tried to pull away, but it tightened its grip around her wrist, pulling her forward, toward the center. Her vision swam as the music's power tore at her mind, the world around her distorted, spinning, bending. The floor beneath her feet seemed to dissolve into a pool of darkness, swallowing the light, swallowing the reality. The shadow twisted around her, pulling her deeper into the center of the circle, closer to the song and dance man. "You will dance until there is nothing left of you," he whispered, his voice now an omnipresent hum in her ears. "You will dance until the song ends, until your very soul is lost to the rhythm." Emma's heart hammered in her chest. She tried to scream, to break free, but her voice was swallowed by the music, her body trapped in its rhythm, her soul tethered to the dark man who controlled it all. Her hands moved on their own accord, the unnatural rhythm forcing her to reach out, to touch the others. Their faces were empty, their eyes glazed, staring into the abyss that had claimed them. She could feel the coldness of their touch, the emptiness that had replaced their souls. They were gone. They were nothing but puppets now. Her feet moved faster, the dance becoming a blur, the shadow tightening its grip around her. She wanted to stop. But the music was louder now, all-encompassing, overwhelming. It filled every corner of her mind, every crevice of her being. She was drowning in it. Then, with a final lurch, everything went still. The music stopped, the shadows retreated. For a brief moment there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Emma stood, panting, her chest heaving with exhaustion, her mind foggy, trying to break free from the lingering grip of the dance. Her hands trembled as she wiped the sweat from her brow, her heart still racing. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her, a suffocating, oppressive void. But it didn't last. The song and dance man stood before her, his head tilted slightly, as if observing her. The mask was as featureless as ever, but she could feel his gaze piercing her, seeing deep into her soul. "It is only just beginning," he said, his voice cold and final. Chapter 3 continued. The Dance of the Damned. Emma's head swam as the darkness seemed to close in on her from all sides. The air itself was thick, stifling, as though the world had been dipped in tar. Each breath was a struggle, and with every inhale, the oppressive weight of the dance grew heavier. Her limbs, which had once obeyed her every command, now felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else. The rhythm, the melody, it was inside her, consuming her, slowly hollowing her out from within. The song and dance man remained still, watching her with an eerie, almost detached calm. It was as if he had all the time in the world to play with her. His form was like a shadow, always there, but never truly present. His mask, that faceless, smooth surface, shimmered slightly, as though it were alive, breathing, pulsing with a malevolent energy. "Dance, Emma," his voice whispered, though there was no movement of his lips. It seemed to emanate from the very air itself, vibrating deep in her bones. "You cannot stop. The song is inside you now, and you will dance until it is over." She could feel it, that gnawing pull, the music tugging at her soul, winding its fingers deep into her chest and squeezing. Every beat, every note was a command, a demand, and no matter how much she fought, her body responded, moving with unnatural grace and precision. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Emma gasped, her voice barely a whisper, drowned out by the ever-growing chorus of sound. The song and dance man's head tilted, his expression unreadable beneath the mask. The air seemed to grow colder, and for a moment, Emma thought she saw shadows swirling around him, flickering like tendrils of smoke. He raised a gloved hand, his fingers long and delicate, and gestured toward the other children. "They are already lost," he said softly, his voice smooth like honey but sharp with an underlying malice. "Just like you will be. There is no escape from the dance, Emma. No escape from the song. Once you hear it, once it touches your soul, you are bound to it, bound to me." The words sent a chill through her entire being. Emma's heart hammered in her chest, panic rising in her throat. She was already lost? Was it too late? Was there no way to stop this madness? She glanced desperately at the other children, hoping, praying that she could see some sign of life in their eyes, something that would prove that they hadn't been consumed completely. But no. Their eyes were empty, vacant. Their faces were pale, drained of color, as if their very spirits had been sucked away, leaving nothing but hollow shells of what they once were. Sophie, the girl who had once been her friend, her connection to this world of madness was a mere reflection of herself. Her face was frozen in that same vacant stare, her mouth moving in the same mechanical rhythm, her body swaying in time with the infernal music. Sophie was gone, swallowed whole by the song and dance man's dark power. "Why?" Emma repeated, more urgently now, her voice shaking. "Why me? What do you want from us?" The song and dance man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step forward, his movements graceful, almost hypnotic, like the dance itself was part of his very essence. The shadows followed him, curling and twisting at his feet. As he moved, the air seemed to grow colder, more oppressive, as though the temperature itself was being drained from the world around them. "What do I want?" he mused, his voice soft but filled with an unsettling edge. "I do not want anything. I'm not bound by desires or whims. I am a force, an inevitable force. I exist to lead the lost, to guide them into the rhythm of the universe. The song is eternal, and you are merely the next in line." Emma's stomach turned. She wanted to run, to fight, but she was trapped. Her body no longer responded to her mind's desperate commands. Instead, her arms rose once more, her feet carried her across the floor, and her body was forced to move in time with the others. She couldn't stop. The music didn't allow it. It was inside her now, beneath her skin, in her very soul. The shadows twisted around her, now seeming almost sentient, reaching out with cold fingers to touch her skin. They coiled around her ankles, up her legs, as if trying to pull her deeper into the dance. She stumbled, but the music only grew louder, faster, more insistent. The darkness seemed to surge, pushing her forward. The tent around her flickered in and out of existence, its walls blurring, warping like a dream. She could feel the boundary between reality and nightmare eroding, and she felt herself slipping into that abyss. The ground beneath her feet pulsed with the beat of the song, as though the earth itself were alive and thrumming with energy. And then, with a sudden jolt, she was no longer in the tent. Wah! Emma's mind reeled as the world around her shifted violently. One moment she was in the suffocating, distorted space of the circus tent. The next, she was standing in the middle of a desolate field, the sky above her an ominous shade of grey, as though the sun had been swallowed by the very air itself. The shadows were still with her. They clung to her, following her every step, like ghosts tethered to her soul. She could still hear the distant echoes of the music, the haunting melody, but it was faint now, as if it had become a part of the world around her. Everywhere she looked, the field stretched out endlessly, barren and empty. Not a single tree, not a single creature to break the endless void. "Where am I?" she whispered to herself, her voice trembling as the fear tightened in her chest. The song and dance man's voice answered her, before she could even finish the thought, his words coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, like a phantom presence that seeped into the air itself. "You are where you need to be, Emma," he said, his tone both patient and predatory. "You are where all those before you have gone, lost, consumed by the rhythm. The world around you is nothing but a reflection of your soul now. Empty, desolate. Do you understand?" Emma's breath caught in her throat. Her mind spun. Was this real? Was any of it real? She had to get out. She had to wake up, but the longer she stood in the field, the more distant her memories seemed. The face of her mother, her home, everything was slipping away, like sand through her fingers. "Why can't I leave?" she gasped, her voice breaking. "Why can't I wake up?" "The dance does not end, Emma. The song will play on, and you will follow, just as they all have before you." Terror began to surge within her as she looked down at her feet, realizing with horror that her body had once again begun to move in time with the rhythm. She could feel her heart pounding, the thudding of her pulse echoing in her ears, as if her very body were in sync with the beat. And in that moment, Emma understood. There was no escape. The music would play on until there was nothing left of her. The song and dance man had said it. She was already lost. Her limbs moved faster now, the rhythm surging through her veins. The music was inside her, filling her chest with dread and longing. She could feel it. It was pulling her down, deeper into the darkness, into the abyss. And as the shadows closed in, as the music swirled around her like a cyclone, Emma gave in. Her feet carried her, her soul slipping away. Chapter 4. The Last Dance. And the field stretched endlessly before Emma, an ocean of emptiness that swallowed the horizon whole. There was no escape, no hope, no way to return to the world she had once known. She could feel it now, the weight of her situation, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. It was as if the very air around her was laced with the music, thick and suffocating, pulling her further into its grasp. She tried to move, to break free, but her feet betrayed her. They moved without her will, her limbs caught in the rhythm of the music. The beat was relentless, like a heart beating in her chest, thrumming through her bones, sinking into her very marrow. The sound, now louder and more insistent, wrapped around her like a chain, binding her to the endless dance. Her body obeyed without question. The steps were precise, too precise, and she hated it. She hated that she could not control her own limbs, that her movements were not her own, that the dance was the only thing that mattered now. The music, His music had become the pulse of the universe. It was everywhere. It was in her blood, in her thoughts. She could feel her sanity unraveling, like thread pulled from a fraying cloth. The song and dance man, that twisted figure who had led her here, was nowhere to be seen, but she could feel his presence, like a shadow that followed her every move. His laughter, soft, cold, and mocking, seemed to echo in her mind. It was the laughter of someone who knew the end before it even began. "You cannot stop, Emma," his voice whispered from the void, like a distant dream. "Not now, not ever." She wanted to scream. She wanted to tear her skin from her body, to rip the rhythm out of her veins, to crush the song beneath her feet. But the music was stronger than she was. It consumed her thoughts, drowned her in its endless swell. There was no space for anything but the dance. Her eyes darted around, searching for something, anything that could break the spell. But there was nothing. No landmarks, no guiding points, just the same barren field that stretched on forever. The air was thick with the stench of rot, the kind that only came from long-forgotten places, where light never reached. The shadows that had once clung to her now seemed to be growing, creeping at the edges of her vision, slithering in and out of the corners of her mind. They whispered to her, their voices low and sibilant, like serpents sliding through the grass. "You belong to him now," they hissed. "You are his, forever." Her stomach churned with nausea, but she couldn't stop. Her feet moved, her body twirled, her arms lifted as if they had a life of their own. She could feel her muscles burning, her joints aching, but there was no relief. Every part of her was caught in the music, in the dance, as though the very rhythm was bleeding into her bones. It was then that she saw them, figures, faint and blurred, standing at the edge of the field. They were like shadows, no more than silhouettes in the fog, their outlines shifting and changing with the movement of the wind. And yet, as she looked closer, she recognized them. They were the children, the ones who had danced before her. They were here, but they were not here. Their eyes were empty, hollow, like forgotten dolls, abandoned by the world. The song and dance man had taken them too. "Help me," Emma whispered, her voice shaking with desperation, though she knew there was no one to hear her. No one who could save her now. But the figures did not respond. They simply watched her, their faces frozen in that same vacant stare. They were trapped too, trapped in the dance, trapped in the song, just as she was. She could feel it in the air, an oppressive weight, the inevitability of their fate, the unspoken truth that they were all bound together by the same dark force. The same music, the same curse. And then, as if to confirm her thoughts, one of the figures, Sophie, moved, slowly, jerkingly. Her body contorted in a way that should have been impossible, her arms flailing out as if she were fighting an unseen force. But there was no fight in her movements. There was no resistance. It was as though Sophie had been reduced to a puppet, her strings pulled by the invisible hand of the song and dance man. "Sophie!" Emma cried, her voice hoarse with fear. Sophie's head snapped toward her. Her eyes were black, bottomless pits, and for a moment, Emma thought she saw something flicker within them, something human, something like recognition. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same vacant stare that all the others wore. And then Sophie began to move toward her, slowly at first, her feet dragging through the dirt. The sound of her footsteps was muffled by the heavy silence, but the air around Emma thickened, as if the very atmosphere was pushing against her, trying to stop her from seeing the truth. "Sophie, please!" Emma begged, her breath catching in her throat. But Sophie did not speak. She did not acknowledge Emma's pleas. She simply moved, her body swaying unnaturally with the rhythm of the music. Her mouth opened, but there were no words, only the hollow, empty sound of air. And then Sophie stopped, right in front of Emma. The air was thick with the tension between them, the weight of the past and the future pressing down on Emma's chest. She could feel the cold seeping into her skin, freezing her from the inside out. The dance, the song, they were consuming her, and Sophie, standing before her now, was the reflection of what she would become, if she didn't find a way out. "Do you hear it?" Sophie's voice, soft and distant, finally broke the silence. Her lips barely moved, but Emma could hear the words clear as day. "Hear what?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "The music," Sophie said, her eyes still empty, her voice like a soft echo. "It never stops. It never stops, Emma. And when you finally give in, you are one with it. You are one with him, the song and dance man." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel it then, the pull, the rhythm, the song, the music. It was inside her, whispering to her from the deepest corners of her mind. It was calling her, demanding her to surrender. She shook her head violently. "No, no, I won't." Sophie's lips curled into a strange, hollow smile. "You already have, Emma. You already have." With that, Sophie stepped back, and the shadowed figures around them seemed to stir. They were all moving now, their bodies swaying, their faces vacant and lifeless, like marionettes strung on invisible threads. Emma's body tensed, her legs moving of their own accord as the beat pulsed louder, like thunder in her ears. She could feel herself being dragged into the dance, the song enveloping her every thought, drowning her resistance. The world around her spun, and she could no longer tell where the shadows ended and where she began. The music was everything. It was the ground beneath her feet. It was the air she breathed. It was the pulse of life. And with every beat, with every movement, she could feel herself slipping further away. "There is no escape," a voice whispered inside her mind. There never was. The air grew colder still, the shadows lengthening around her, twisting like serpents. The music was rising, building to a crescendo, and Emma felt herself being pulled, her feet no longer her own, her body no longer a part of her. The song and dance man's laughter echoed in her ears. Chapter 5. The Puppeteer's Threads. The music had settled into Emma's bones like an eternal echo. It crept beneath her skin, whispering to her in ways she could not fully comprehend. She could no longer discern the line between thought and sound, reality and illusion. Every breath she took felt like a symphony, each inhale a note, each exhale a reverberation, as though the world itself was conducting the orchestra of her life. It was a strange thing, this feeling of being bound to something invisible. At first, the sensation of the music inside her had been a distant discomfort, a low hum she could almost ignore, but now it was her heartbeat, her pulse. It thrummed in her ears, raced through her veins, tugging at her very soul. Her feet moved without her consent. Even when she tried to resist, they obeyed the rhythm. The dance, that cursed endless dance, was taking her deeper into the field of shadows. She could still see Sophie's vacant eyes in her mind, and the hollow smile that had twisted the once familiar face into something unrecognizable. Sophie had warned her. "You already have," she had said. "You already have." The words slithered through Emma's thoughts like a venomous snake. Emma wanted to scream, to tear the darkness out of her, but the music kept her locked in place, a marionette with strings too tight to break. She tried to focus on the few fragments of hope left, the flickers of memory that hadn't yet been consumed by the dance. The faces of the others, Sophie, Liam, the children, flashed in her mind. They were not the same anymore. They were something else, something lost. A low sound stirred the air. It wasn't music, not exactly. It was something far worse, far more sinister. A scraping sound, the kind you might hear when something ancient stirs beneath the earth, clawing its way to the surface. Emma's eyes darted to the horizon, where the shifting darkness seemed to swirl and churn. There, amidst the fog, something moved. At first, it was hard to tell what it was. Just a shape, an indistinct silhouette standing against the mist. But as Emma's gaze sharpened, her heart twisted in her chest. The figure was tall, impossibly tall. Its form stretched unnaturally against the backdrop of the night. It stood motionless, but its presence was as heavy as the air around her. Emma's body slowed, the rhythm of her steps faltering for just a moment. And then she heard it. A voice. A soft, melodic whisper that seemed to emanate from all directions at once. "You cannot escape." The voice was distant but unmistakably clear, as though it was spoken just behind her ear. Emma froze, her body no longer obeying her will. Her breath hitched, and for a fleeting moment the world seemed to shift, the edges of her reality blurring. She tried to turn, but her feet, still tethered to the rhythm of the dance, refused to move. The figure in the distance remained silent, but something was changing. The music was louder now, growing more insistent, like 1,000 violins drawn across the strings of her very soul. The wind seemed to pick up, swirling in unnatural patterns, pulling the fog into strange spirals that danced in time with the relentless beat. With horror, Emma realized that the figure was no longer static. It was coming closer. The air around her thickened, as if the very atmosphere was tightening, choking her. She struggled to breathe, her chest constricting with the mounting pressure. The figure loomed larger, its outline more defined, revealing more disturbing details with each passing second. It wasn't a man, not entirely. There was something about it, its unnatural proportions, its twisted limbs, that set it apart from any human form she had known. It had no face. Not in the way that people did anyway. What should have been a face was an empty, voided mass, an abyss. Emma felt herself drawn toward it, her body betraying her will once again. Her feet shuffled forward, closer to the dark figure, the music thrumming in time with her steps. "You are already ours." The voice coiled around her like a snake. "No one leaves the dance, not once you've heard the music." Emma could feel it then, the unrelenting tug of the music, pulling at her very essence. She could not resist. The pull was too strong, the rhythm too loud. Her limbs ached with the strain, but she could not stop. She could not escape. "No escape," the figure whispered, its words seeping into her like poison. "There are no exits, no safe places. You are all ours now." Emma's breath quickened, her pulse racing in sync with the ominous thrum of the music. Her mind whirled, searching for something, anything that might help her break free. She couldn't understand it. Why was she still alive? Why had she been chosen? And why, above all else, was the music so persistent, so insidious? And then it struck her. The song and dance man was not just controlling her movements. No, he was inside her. He was weaving his dark influence into every fiber of her being, every thought, every memory. The dance was not merely an act of physical movement. It was an act of possession, of becoming. The realization hit her like a hammer. She was no longer Emma. Not truly. She was an echo, a shadow of who she had been. The music, the song, it was a web, and she had been caught in it, tangled within the threads of its creator's design. "You belong to the rhythm now," the figure whispered again. "You cannot fight it. You will never be free." The cold that washed over Emma was deeper than any physical chill. It sank into her soul, freezing her from the inside out, and with it came the sharp awareness that she was not alone. There were others too. Her mind reached out, as if feeling for them, sensing their presence in the same twisted space. The field around her was not empty. No, it was filled with countless others, figures, long-forgotten souls who had danced before her, consumed by the same fate. Their hollow eyes, their lifeless faces. They were here, caught in the same endless loop. They were trapped, just as she was. The music had claimed them all. "You will dance until the end of time," the figure intoned. "And when you can no longer feel, when you can no longer think, you will join them. You will become one with the song." Emma's world began to spin again. Her body moved in time with the pulse of the music, and with each step, her resistance weakened. The shadows began to swirl around her, pulling her deeper into the nightmare. The presence of the figure loomed large, its faceless visage growing nearer with each passing second. But in the corner of her mind, one thought flickered, small and fragile. What if there was a way to break free? It was a question that had no answer, not yet. But Emma wasn't ready to surrender. Not completely. Somewhere, deep down, she knew there had to be a way to stop the music, to break the threads of the dance that bound her, and she was willing to do anything. Anything to escape. Chapter 5, continued. The Puppeteer's Threads. Emma's senses were stretched taut, caught between the jagged edges of her memories, and the overwhelming weight of the music that reverberated within her. The darkness around her had begun to take on a shape. No longer just shadows, but something darker, more deliberate, more malignant. The air tasted like copper, sharp and metallic. Her body, now a mere instrument of the music, moved as though it was no longer hers. It belonged to the rhythm, to the song and dance man, and every step she took was a silent scream, every breath a quiet surrender. The figure was closer now. The faceless thing that had been nothing but an unsettling silhouette in the distance was now a looming presence, towering over her like some ancient deity of decay. The emptiness where its face should have been was like a black hole, pulling at her consciousness, erasing her identity one tiny piece at a time. With each step, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, as though she were no longer walking on solid earth, but on something alive, something that shifted with every footfall, groaning with the weight of countless footsteps that had trodden before her. Her legs were unsteady, her mind fogged with the suffocating pull of the rhythm. She felt the burning desire to run, to flee, but she couldn't. It wasn't that she didn't want to escape. No, it was far worse than that. She couldn't move any other way. There was no fight left in her. The puppet strings that bound her were drawn so tight that she was beyond resistance, beyond anything she had ever known. She was a part of the dance now. The figure in front of her did not move. It stood in stillness, its limbs unnaturally long, elongated like a marionette's, twisted and wrong in ways Emma couldn't fully comprehend. The only motion came from the swirling fog around it, which seemed to ripple and undulate with an unnatural rhythm of its own. The whispers had stopped, replaced by the hum of the music that had filled her every thought. But the silence left room for something else, a sensation that gnawed at the edges of her mind, a coldness, deeper than the mist itself, a chilling awareness that she wasn't alone. There were others. She could feel them now, their presence in the air. She wasn't sure how, but the sense of them, the others, gnawed at her insides like a hungry beast. Figures, shadowy forms hidden in the fog, moving as one with her, dancing the same endless steps. They were echoes, remnants of those who had danced before, those who had lost themselves to the music. She closed her eyes, but it didn't matter. The music still played. The dance still called. She couldn't shut it out. Her body jerked forward, an involuntary motion that carried her toward the faceless figure. The voice of the figure slithered through the air like the faintest whisper, but there was no mistaking the venom in its tone. It wasn't an invitation anymore. It was a command. "Join us," the voice rasped, its syllables stretching out as though they were made of silk and smoke. "There is no escape from the dance. You will never be free. All you can do is dance, Emma. Dance until you become like the rest." The world around her began to warp, the shadows melding together in impossible shapes, twisting into the bodies of those who had once danced before her. Their faces were hollow, their eyes nothing but dark sockets where nothing but despair could be seen. Emma could feel them, their cold presence surrounding her, guiding her movements with the rhythm of their collective despair. Her thoughts raced, struggling to hold on to the fading fragments of herself. There had to be something. There had to be a way to break free. But what could she do? What could anyone do against something this ancient? The music. It had claimed everyone before her. It had swallowed them whole, turning them into hollow versions of themselves. They had danced for so long that they had forgotten their names, their faces, their humanity. They had been consumed by the song. "You are just one more," the figure whispered again, its voice now a cacophony, 1,000 voices blending together. "One more puppet. One more marionette." Her limbs twitched. The fog around her thickened, curling into sharp tendrils that wrapped around her like invisible chains, pulling her closer to the figure. She was being drawn in, bit by bit, her body moving without her permission, every step pulling her deeper into the dark center of the dance. Then, in the distance, she saw something, a flicker of light, a glimpse of what she remembered as the outside world. The idea of freedom, though faint, still flickered in her mind like a distant star. The fog seemed to recoil slightly at the thought of it, and Emma's pulse quickened. Was it real? Was there a way out? She forced herself to slow down. The rhythm of the dance demanded that she keep moving, but for the first time she resisted. Every step she took now felt like a struggle against the pull, against the unrelenting call of the music. She focused on the light, drawing it into her mind, making it a beacon that she could fixate on. A few more steps, then another, and another. Her legs shook with the effort, but she was moving, her body fighting the music for the first time. But just as quickly as the light had appeared, it flickered and vanished. The figure let out a low, guttural laugh, a sound that echoed across the field. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The shadows pressed closer. The music swelled louder, and her heart began to race in terror. "You think you can escape?" The voice was mocking now. "You think you can break free from the dance? There is no escape, Emma. You are ours. You have always been ours." The figures of the others closed in, their twisted forms reaching out to her with their empty hands, their mouths stretched into grotesque smiles that shouldn't have existed. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run, but all she could do was dance. And then, as if it had been waiting for her to realize the truth, the figure stepped forward. It was taller now, far taller than before. Its body was nothing but shadows, dark and oppressive. And yet Emma could feel its presence, its power. It was the source of the music, the rhythm, the chaos, the song and dance man. His head moved in an unnatural angle, as though the bones inside his neck could not properly bend. The black void that should have been his face pulsed, expanding and contracting like an abyss of dark energy, drawing her in. "You will never be the same," the voice rasped, its words distorting like the sound of metal scraping against stone. "You are already one of us. You cannot turn back. The dance will consume you." Emma's legs were moving again, her feet pulling her forward, each step blending into the next until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. She was lost in the rhythm, her thoughts slipping through her fingers like water. She couldn't fight it. She couldn't stop it. The dance had taken her, and then, just when she thought she could bear it no longer, something inside her snapped. For the briefest of moments, the music faltered, like a record skipping, and in that gap, Emma heard something she hadn't heard before. It was faint, barely perceptible, a voice, not the song and dance man, not the others, but someone else, a whisper of a name. Chapter 6. The Echoes of Silence. Emma's world had become an unending cacophony of music, a sickening rhythmic pulse that had taken root deep in her soul. The song and dance man was all around her, his voice echoing through the fog that clung to her skin like a second layer. The air felt suffocating, thick with the remnants of something long forgotten, as if the very atmosphere was an ancient memory, steeped in the horrors of time itself. Her limbs moved, as if on their own accord, her body no longer responding to her commands, but to the beat that guided her every step. The music was an omnipresent force, a relentless tide pulling her deeper into its grasp, until it felt as though there was no longer any distinction between herself and the music. It was her, and she was it. The song and dance man's presence was suffocating. He was everywhere, an unshakable figure who seemed to linger in the corners of her mind, waiting for her to give in completely. His shadow stretched long and thin, moving like liquid across the mist, the faintest outline of his form, a reminder that she was never truly alone. The others were with him, his silent dancers, their vacant eyes hollow and filled with a despair that mirrored her own. It was when the whispers began that she realized she wasn't just hearing the song and dance man anymore. The voices, soft, almost imperceptible at first, slipped in and out of her consciousness, as though they were just beyond the veil, waiting for her to reach out. Some sounded like words, while others were only fragments of sentences, broken thoughts, disjointed cries. But they all carried the same weight, the same haunting sense of foreboding. "You're not alone," the whisper began, distant and cold. Emma tried to focus, tried to make sense of the voice, but the music roared louder, drowning out everything else. The dance continued, its steps now deeply embedded in her body, and she had no control. Her feet followed the rhythm, her legs twisting and turning, contorting in ways that felt unnatural. Her arms moved with a grace that was foreign, like someone had taken control of her very being. But the whisper, It persisted. You are not alone. You never were. She tried to stop, to fight against the pull, but her body no longer obeyed her. She wanted to scream, to shout, to break free of the invisible strings that held her so tightly, but her voice was swallowed by the music. Her thoughts were consumed by it. She was nothing more than a puppet, and yet, the whisper. It was still there, pulling at her thoughts, a thread of clarity in the midst of the chaos. Sophie, you must remember. The voice was clearer now, familiar, like an echo from a time she couldn't quite grasp. Sophie, that name, that voice. She remembered it now, though the memory felt distant, like something buried beneath the weight of years. Sophie. Her sister? A friend? Someone she had lost long ago, perhaps? The memory was foggy, clouded by the relentless pull of the music, but it felt important. So important. She had to remember. With every ounce of strength, Emma reached for the memory, trying to pull it from the depths of her mind. Her fingers twitched, her hands trembling, but she was still bound by the dance. She could not stop, could not slow down. The music commanded her, and the song and dance man was its master. You must find her. The whisper persisted, growing more insistent. She knows, she has the answers. Find Sophie. But where? How could she even begin to find someone in this suffocating fog of shadows and sound? Her head spun as she tried to concentrate, tried to push past the overwhelming presence of the song and dance man, the pull of the music, the hypnotic rhythm. It was everywhere, beneath her skin, in her bones, in the very core of her being. She was becoming it, becoming one of them. Her vision blurred, and for a fleeting moment, she felt the sensation of something slipping away. She was losing herself piece by piece. But the whisper refused to fade, refusing to be drowned out by the music. Find Sophie, it urged again, its voice breaking through the layers of noise that surrounded her. She's in the dark. She's waiting for you. The fog shifted, swirling around her like a living thing, moving with purpose. It was pulling her forward, guiding her steps. She wasn't walking anymore. She was being led. But where? Where was she going? The shapes around her were starting to solidify, taking on more distinct forms, though none of them had faces. They were all moving, dancing, yes, but not like her. They were shadows of themselves, broken things caught in an endless loop of some twisted performance. And yet, there was something different about them now. Emma could feel it, feel their eyes on her, feel the cold emptiness they exuded. They were waiting for her to join them. But the thought of doing so made her blood run cold. She didn't belong with them. Not yet. The fog thickened again, this time so dense that she could hardly see more than a few inches in front of her. The music, no longer just a sound but an all-consuming presence, surged louder, the rhythm reverberating through her body, making her heart race. She could hear the faint, hollow breaths of the others around her, their gasps and sighs blending with the unearthly music. They were close, so close. Then, as the fog parted, she saw her, Sophie. The figure stood in the center of the clearing, a lone silhouette against the thick, swirling mist. She was motionless, standing in the midst of the swirling fog like a beacon of hope in the endless darkness. But something was wrong. The figure was too still, too silent. Emma's heart stopped. The music seemed to falter for a moment, its rhythm erratic, as though it too had sensed her presence. Sophie stood there, staring ahead, her face hidden beneath a shadowy veil. Emma wanted to cry out, to run to her, but her body would not obey. "Sophie," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the cacophony of the music. Sophie did not move. She did not respond. And then the music came back with a vengeance, louder than before, drowning out Emma's thoughts, drowning out everything but the dance. The fog thickened once more, and Sophie disappeared into the mist. Emma's mind raced. Had she imagined it? Was Sophie really there? Or had the dance twisted her perception, forcing her to see what she so desperately wanted to believe? But Emma couldn't afford to doubt. She couldn't afford to give in. She had to find Sophie. With a surge of defiance, Emma pushed forward, fighting against the pull of the music, her body trembling under the weight of the rhythm that sought to claim her. She took a step, then another, and another. Her legs screamed in protest, but she ignored it. She was moving towards the dark shape she had seen in the mist, towards the only clue, the only hope she had left. The song and dance man's laughter echoed in her ears. "You cannot escape," it whispered. "You are ours, Emma. You will always be ours." But Emma wasn't listening anymore. She was moving towards the mist, moving towards Sophie, and no matter how tight the threads of the dance wrapped around her, no matter how loud the music became, she would not stop. She could not stop. Not now. Chapter 7. The Haunting Pulse. With the fog that surrounded Emma thickened like an impenetrable wall, seeping into her lungs, her eyes, and every thought that passed through her mind. She could feel it now, the weight of the air, as if the very atmosphere conspired against her, pressing her down, stealing her breath, drowning her in its suffocating grasp. The song and dance man's laughter echoed through the mist, distant and mocking, yet impossibly close, reverberating inside her skull. She stumbled forward, unable to stop, her limbs moving without her command. Her body swayed to the rhythm, unwilling to resist. The music was an extension of her. Every movement, every breath, every heartbeat aligned with its sinister pulse. She was becoming a part of it, slipping further into the macabre dance that had taken root in her very soul. But then, there, just beyond the haze, she saw it again. Sophie. The silhouette, standing like a ghost in the fog, her form almost indistinguishable from the shadows that swirled around her. Emma's heart hammered in her chest, each beat reverberating like the thundering drums of some unholy march. She tried to shout, to cry out, but no sound came. The music drowned her voice, suffocating it before it even had a chance to escape. Sophie was still, unnervingly so, like a statue frozen in time. Her face remained hidden beneath the veil of shadow, a darkness that seemed to stretch out from her form and consume everything around her. Emma could feel it, the pull, an invisible thread that tied her to Sophie, to the mystery of her absence, to the silence that seemed to suffocate the very air. She reached out, her hands trembling, the cold fog curling around her fingers like the fingers of a dead man, pulling her in. "Sophie." The word was a whisper, barely audible over the oppressive music. But the figure did not move. For a fleeting moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The fog stilled. The music paused, its rhythm faltering as though it had lost its rhythm for a split second. In that silence, Emma dared to hope that she might finally reach Sophie, that the connection would be made, that she could pull her sister, her only tether to the world of the living, out from the shadows. But then the music surged again, more chaotic than before, like the crashing of waves against jagged rocks. And Sophie was gone. Emma screamed, but the sound was swallowed whole by the cacophony that filled the air. She turned, frantic, her eyes searching the fog, the shadows, the nothingness. She was alone again, completely alone, lost in the vast emptiness of the mist. The dance continued. The others, those pale, hollow-eyed figures, had returned to their movements, their haunting, mechanical steps. They did not look at her. They did not acknowledge her presence. They were nothing but automatons, locked in an eternal, mindless performance. The music took hold of her once more, pulling her into its rhythm, making her a part of the dance. She could not stop. She could not resist. "Find her," the whisper echoed again. But this time, it was not Sophie's voice. No, this was different. The voice was older, heavier, more insistent. "Find what was lost." Find what was lost? The words didn't make sense. How could she find something that had never been found? How could she retrieve something that had been buried in the deepest corners of her soul? Sophie was the key. Sophie was the answer. But what if Sophie was lost forever? The thought was unbearable. A cold, gnawing dread that threatened to swallow her whole. She had to find her. She had to break free from the cycle, from the endless march of music and shadow. But how? Suddenly, the fog parted again, and a cold wind swept through, sharp and biting, as though the very air itself was rejecting her. She gasped for breath, her body recoiling from the chill, and in the distance, she saw it, a figure moving toward her. At first, Emma thought it was Sophie, but no, this was not Sophie. This was something else, something far worse. The figure emerged from the fog, tall and imposing, shrouded in darkness. Its face, if it had one, was hidden beneath a hood of shadow, a void that seemed to absorb the light around it. There was no sound as it moved, no footsteps, no breath. Just an unnatural silence that pressed against Emma's ears. It stopped just in front of her. And for a long moment, they stood there, two figures in the mist, locked in a silent standoff. Then the figure moved again, its arm reaching out with a speed that was almost too fast to see. Emma gasped and stumbled back, but the hand, if it could be called a hand, wrapped around her wrist, cold and unyielding, pulling her forward. The grip was like iron, its fingers long and twisted, like the claws of some ancient creature. "You cannot escape!" The voice was a rasp, ancient and malevolent, filling her head with its horrible weight. "The dance will claim you. It always does." The music roared to life again, louder than ever before, and Emma's body lurched forward against her will, as if being dragged by the force of the music itself. The figure, whatever it was, held her tightly, keeping her in place as the rhythm surged around them. She could feel it now, the music, the dance, the very essence of this place. It was a prison, a trap built on centuries of souls lost to the song. The music was more than just sound. It was life itself, a heartbeat that never stopped, a pulse that drew everyone into its endless orbit. Emma fought back, her body fighting against the hold of the figure, against the music. But it was no use. The dance continued, relentless, pulling her deeper into its depths. She was a marionette, a puppet, a shadow among shadows. "You are part of it now," the figure hissed, its voice a cold whisper in her ear. "There is no escaping the song and dance, man. You will dance forever, just like the others. You will never know freedom again." Emma struggled, her mind racing, her thoughts frantically trying to piece together the truth. Sophie. She had to find Sophie. There was no other way out. But the more she struggled, the more she became aware of the terrible truth. There was no escape. The music had already claimed her. She was already part of the dance. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness take her. And in that darkness, she heard it. The whisper, "Sophie is the key." Emma's eyes snapped open, and the world around her seemed to shift. The music, once all-consuming, seemed to falter, just for a moment. The fog began to swirl in a different direction, like it had a life of its own. Sophie was the key. The figure holding her did not move. It was still, its grip unyielding, but in the distance, Emma saw a faint glow. It was a light, soft and warm, like a memory. It was Sophie. Emma could feel it. Sophie was near. She had to reach her. With every last ounce of strength, Emma tore herself away from the figure's grip. She ran. She didn't know where she was going, didn't know what path to follow, but she ran anyway, driven by a single thought. Find Sophie. The music began to shift again, becoming a distant thrum in her ears. It was no longer pulling her in. She was breaking free. But for how long? Chapter 7. The Dance of Shadows. The air was thick, suffocating, and the music still echoed in Emma's mind, though it had softened just enough for her to hear her own frantic breath. Her heart pounded with each step she took, each desperate movement toward the distant light, the faint, flickering presence of Sophie that seemed just out of reach. The fog clung to her, a wet, choking blanket that refused to let her breathe freely. But there was something else now, a new feeling crawling under her skin, twisting her thoughts. It was the shadow of something, lurking just beyond her perception, always there but never fully visible. She could feel it at her back, like the breath of 1,000 unseen eyes watching her every move. The deeper she ventured, the stronger this presence became, its weight pressing down on her chest, making her lungs burn. "Sophie," Emma whispered, the name escaping her lips like a prayer, a hope, a plea. But the only response was the music, now more intense, more chaotic. It had come back full force, like a storm raging in her mind, impossible to ignore. Each note of the melody seemed to reverberate in her bones, like something ancient, something predatory. She could almost see it, its essence, skittering just out of sight, waiting for her to let her guard down. But Emma wasn't going to let it win. She couldn't. She had to reach Sophie. With every step, the fog became thicker, the light fainter. It was as if the world itself was bending, folding in on her, creating a labyrinth that led nowhere. Her breath hitched as she stumbled over something soft. A body. No, it was a patch of thick, wet moss, clinging to the ground like something alive. She recoiled, wiping her hands against her coat, as if she could scrub away the eerie sensation that lingered on her skin. It wasn't just the fog anymore. It wasn't just the music. Something was here with her. A whisper, a barely perceptible sound, like the rustling of leaves in a forgotten cemetery. Emma stopped dead in her tracks, straining her ears, trying to catch the source. But there was nothing. Nothing except the distant thrumming of the music, growing louder with every passing second. And then it came again, the whisper. Leave her. She is not yours to find. Emma spun around, her heart skipping a beat. There was no one there. Nothing. But the voice. It was clear now, ringing in her ears, as if someone had spoken right next to her, breathing down her neck. Leave her. You will only bring her pain. The words were not her own thoughts. No, this was something else, something alive and dark, feeding on her fear. Emma clenched her fists, shaking her head, as if trying to rid herself of the voice, of the dark presence that loomed just outside her vision. I won't leave her. I won't, she hissed through gritted teeth, her voice trembling. The fog parted for a brief moment, revealing a shape in the distance. She gasped, her breath freezing in her chest as the figure emerged from the mist. It was Sophie, or at least it looked like Sophie. The girl standing before her was draped in a tattered white dress, her hair hanging in long black strands that framed her face in shadow. But it wasn't Sophie's face. No, this was wrong. The eyes that stared back at Emma were hollow, black pits, devoid of any warmth or humanity. The smile that spread across the figure's lips was twisted, cruel, and far too wide to be natural. The smile of something that had once been human, but was now lost to the void. Sophie. Emma's voice was weak, a whisper of hope amidst the madness. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head, the motion slow, deliberate, like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. And then, the music rose again. The melody, once a distant hum, now filled the space around them with an intensity that seemed to push against Emma's skin, pushing her back, pushing her away from the figure. It was like a physical force, as if the song itself had become a weapon, driving her to the edge of despair. The figure in front of her took a step forward and the fog seemed to move with it. Emma's breath caught as the space around her began to distort, the ground shifting beneath her feet, the air growing cold and oppressive. The figure raised its hand, and with that single motion, the world around them began to warp and twist. The fog deepened into a suffocating darkness, swallowing the light that had once guided Emma's path. The trees, if there were trees, became jagged silhouettes, their branches reaching out like claws. The earth itself seemed to groan under the pressure, as if the very ground was buckling beneath some unseen weight. Emma took a step back, fear clawing at her insides. She had to get away. She had to escape. But as she turned, she saw them. The others. The figures in the shadows, those pale, faceless souls that had once danced in the fog, were now emerging from the mist. One by one, they shuffled forward, their eyes vacant, their faces twisted masks of agony. They were watching her, watching with eyes that saw nothing, eyes that felt nothing, eyes that had been hollowed out by the dance they were bound to. You can't run, Emma. The voice, that same voice from before, rang in her ears again, its tone so insistent, so final. You are part of it now. There is no escape. Her heart raced. The world was closing in on her. She was surrounded, and there, just behind the faceless crowd, Sophie's twisted figure took another step forward. Leave her, Emma. It was no longer just a whisper. The voice filled the space around her, filling her ears, her mind, her soul. It was all around her, suffocating her thoughts, drowning her will. It was the song and dance man, The one who had watched from the shadows all this time. The one who had pulled the strings, manipulating the dance, controlling the movements of the lost souls that wandered this foggy nightmare. Emma's legs buckled beneath her, the weight of the darkness pressing down on her, the grip of the dance tightening around her was too much. She fell to her knees, her breath ragged, her body trembling with the overwhelming force of the terror that suffocated her. The figures surrounding her closed in, their movements synchronized, their faces still hidden in shadow, their eyes dull and lifeless. But Emma could feel them, feel their emptiness, their hopelessness, the terrible truth of their existence. They were nothing but remnants, echoes of the lost, doomed to wander this place forever, bound to the music, to the dance. And as the figure of Sophie, no, not Sophie, moved closer, Emma's world began to collapse in on itself. She could feel the darkness closing in around her, drowning her, pulling her under. The last thought that flickered through her mind was a single desperate cry. No, I won't be like them. But the music swallowed her voice. The figures surrounded her. The fog grew thick, darker, and as she felt herself slip into the cold embrace of the endless dance, the words came to her, just before the abyss consumed her. The dance will never end. Chapter 8. The song that never ends. The fog rolled in thick, and the ground beneath Emma's trembling feet seemed to heave with every step she took, as though the earth itself was breathing. The cold, damp air stung her skin, clinging to her clothes, making every movement feel labored, as if her body was slowly sinking into the mire of this cursed place. Her mind reeled from the horrors she had witnessed. Sophie's twisted, empty gaze, the faceless figures, and the relentless force that had pushed her into this nightmare. The music still rang in her ears, louder now, like a living entity that pulsed with a strange rhythm, an irresistible pull. It was a haunting melody, familiar and foreign at the same time, its tune forever etched into the fabric of her soul. No, I won't fall like the others. I won't let it take me. Emma's thoughts were fractured, slipping between moments of clarity and the creeping sensation that she was losing herself to the madness. She had to find a way out. The fog was disorienting, making every direction seem the wrong one. The darkness ahead promised nothing but the unknown, more torment, more confusion, more lies. And yet, through the swirling mist, Emma felt an undeniable tug, not the music, not the fog, but something else, something deeper, more primal, like a thread that was pulling her toward an unseen force. It was the same force that had followed her from the beginning, the one that had lured Sophie into the dance, the one that had snatched away her friend and left Emma to wander in her place. The dance, as they called it, the song and dance man's twisted creation. She tried to fight it, but the pull was too strong. It wrapped around her, a sinister grip tightening like a noose, drawing her in, deeper into the fog, further into the darkness. In the distance, she thought she saw something, a flicker of light, faint but steady, like a lighthouse guiding her through the storm. She reached for it, her hand trembling as if it was the only thing keeping her tethered to sanity. And then she heard it, a voice. It was distant at first, like a whisper through a dream, but it grew clearer with each passing second. The tone was sweet, luring, seductive, like a lullaby sung in the dead of night, but there was something off about it. It was wrong. "Come closer, Emma," the voice purred, sending chills down her spine. "Come and see. Come and dance." She stopped in her tracks, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the fog had taken on a life of its own. The whisper, now sharp and insistent, wrapped around her mind, drowning out the sound of her own heartbeat. She couldn't see the source of the voice, but she could feel it. Its presence was undeniable, a weight on her chest, suffocating her. "It's too late," the voice whispered again, a hint of mockery in its tone. "The dance has already begun. You're already part of it." Emma's breath hitched. Was it Sophie's voice? No, this was something else, something far older, more dangerous. Her heart pounded faster, a mix of fear and disbelief rising in her throat. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" There was a pause. A beat of silence that seemed to stretch into eternity. And then, the voice returned, this time louder, more forceful. I am the song and dance. It echoed in her mind, reverberating like a drumbeat in her skull. And you are mine. Emma stumbled back, her mind racing. The song and dance man. The entity that had been controlling everything, the music, the fog, the twisted figures, was here, right in front of her, or at least, its presence was. She could feel it, the weight of its gaze, the pressure of its existence pressing in on her from all sides. And then, the figures emerged from the fog again. They were closer this time, their forms more defined, the faceless ones, the dancers. But they weren't alone anymore. There were more of them, too many to count. Their eyes were hollow, empty voids, like dark pools that sucked in all light, all hope. They reached out for her with thin, bony hands, their fingers crooked and broken, like the claws of something predatory. No, Emma whispered, shaking her head in disbelief, her legs frozen in place. Please, no. But the figures didn't stop. They advanced, slowly, methodically, closing the gap between them and Emma with every breath she took. Their movements were fluid, unnatural, as if they were gliding rather than walking, as if they were part of the very fog that had swallowed this cursed land. You can't escape the dance, Emma. One of them spoke, its voice a low, rasping hiss that sent a shiver down her spine. You are already part of it. No, I'm not, Emma muttered to herself, her voice trembling, but she couldn't help the fear that gripped her. I won't dance. I won't. But her words were swallowed by the music, the song that never ended, the melody that surrounded her like a physical force, tugging at her, pulling her in. Her thoughts grew muddled, her resolve weakening with every note, every step that the dancers took toward her. They were close now, close enough that she could hear the ragged breaths they took, the whispering sounds of their dry, cracked skin brushing against one another. Emma's pulse quickened as the first dancer reached out for her, its hand cold as ice, its grip firm, unyielding. She tried to pull away, but her body betrayed her, her limbs uncooperative, as though the song itself had taken hold of her. Dance with us. The voice of the figure was sweet and cruel. You've already begun. It's too late to stop now. She tried to scream, to break free, but the words never came. The music consumed her, drowning out her thoughts, her resistance, until there was nothing left but the rhythm, the dance. And she moved, unwillingly, against her will. Her body swayed to the beat, her feet stepping in time with the rest of the dancers, though her mind screamed in protest. She was no longer Emma. She was part of the dance, part of the song, and it would never end. Chapter 9. The final step. The fog had thickened around Emma, wrapping itself around her like a suffocating blanket, its chill seeping into her bones. Her breath came in shallow gasps, barely enough to keep the dark, oppressive air at bay. The dancers, if they could even be called that, moved with mechanical precision, their empty eyes fixed on her, their faces devoid of emotion or expression, like puppets controlled by strings unseen. She could hear the steady, hypnotic beat of the music still ringing in her ears, pulling her in, drawing her closer to the center of the nightmare. The song was the same, a slow, mournful melody that vibrated through her skull, resonating with every heartbeat. It felt as if it had always been there, lurking beneath the surface of her thoughts, waiting for the moment when she would finally succumb. And now, it was too late. She could no longer fight it. You are ours, a voice whispered, so close that Emma could feel the breath against her ear. We are your family. Emma tried to scream, but the sound was choked in her throat. Her body refused to obey, her feet moving without her consent, her arms lifting as though pulled by invisible strings. Every part of her resisted, but the compulsion was too strong. She was dancing, not out of choice, but out of necessity. The dancers surrounded her, their bodies moving in perfect unison with hers, their movements as fluid as water. They twirled and swayed, an eerie ballet that had no beginning and no end. Emma's limbs felt heavy, like lead, but they obeyed the rhythm of the song. Every step, every turn, every shift in position seemed to tear her further from herself, her identity unraveling with each passing second. Her vision blurred, the edges of her consciousness darkening, but the song, oh, the song, kept her tethered to the twisted reality she found herself in. It was everywhere, vibrating in her chest, crawling beneath her skin, whispering in the corners of her mind. She had no choice but to follow. Step by step, her gaze shifted, and for a moment, she saw Sophie's face again. But it wasn't the Sophie she remembered. Her friend's face was contorted, her mouth stretched in a grotesque grin, her eyes hollow and dark, like empty wells. Sophie's once beautiful features had twisted into something unrecognizable, a reflection of the creature she had become. But Sophie was still there, still moving, still part of the dance. And then Emma realized it. The song wasn't just about the music, it was about the dance that was endless. The dance that took you, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the movement, the rhythm, the eternal pull. Look around, Emma. Sophie's voice was soft, yet somehow louder than the music. We are all part of it now. We can never escape. Emma's heart skipped a beat, but there was no fear left in her. Fear had long been replaced by something else, something darker, more insidious. She could feel it too, the pull to let go, to surrender, to give in to the endless rhythm. The fog shifted again, swirling with a new intensity. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and she felt it, something stirring in the air. A presence, powerful and ancient, watching, waiting. The song and dance man. Emma had heard his name before, the figure that haunted this cursed land. The force behind the music, the one who had trapped them all in this endless waltz of death. His presence loomed over them, an oppressive weight, like a shadow that stretched far beyond the fog. And then Emma saw him. He was standing at the edge of the dance, his back turned, watching them, the song and dance man. His form was dark, like a silhouette against the mist, his outline shifting, flickering, as if he were made of smoke. His clothes, if they could even be called that, were torn, ragged, a mix of rags and ancient fabric, woven together in strange patterns that twisted in impossible ways. His face was obscured by a hood, but Emma could feel his gaze, even without seeing his eyes. He was the conductor, the puppet master. He was the one who controlled everything, the music, the dancers, the fog, the very air they breathed. He was the source of the endless waltz, and they were his instruments. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she took a step forward, compelled by something deep within her. Her body moved, as if guided by invisible strings, each step echoing the rhythm of the song. She was losing herself. She could feel it. She could feel herself slipping away, becoming one with the dance, becoming one with the eternal music that ruled their fate. But there was something else now, something new, a crack in the music. At first, it was subtle, a discordant note, a sharp break in the smooth flow of the melody. Emma's chest tightened as she tried to focus, trying to make sense of the shift. The song had always been unyielding, an unbroken force that guided them. But now, it faltered, it stuttered. It was as if something was wrong. Do you hear it? Sophie's voice was no longer soothing. There was an edge to it, a crack in her tone. The song, it's changing. Emma could feel it too. The music was no longer the same. It had become jagged, harsh, dissonant. The rhythm was still there, but now it was erratic, frenzied, like a heartbeat that had grown wild, out of control. It was no longer a lullaby, it was a scream. And in the distance, the song and dance man turned, his face hidden beneath the hood. Emma could feel his presence, stronger now, like a dark cloud looming overhead. He was the source of it all, the one who had woven the dance, the song, the curse. But now, as the music twisted and warped, Emma realized something. The song and dance man wasn't in control anymore. Something had changed. The dance was slipping from his grasp. "What have you done?" Emma whispered to herself. "What is happening?" The fog began to shift once more, But this time, it wasn't the same. The swirling mist seemed to writhe, moving of its own accord, pulling away from the figures, from the dancers. It was as if the very air was rejecting the music, pushing it out, trying to tear it apart. Emma's heart raced as the figures around her paused, their movements faltering. The music screeched, a high-pitched, inhuman wail that echoed across the mist. The dancers stumbled, their feet dragging, their bodies jerking as though they were caught in a violent wind. And then, a scream tore through the air. A scream not from Emma, not from Sophie, but from the song and dance man. The darkness around them swirled violently as the song and dance man's form began to flicker, his silhouette warping, like smoke dissipating in the wind. The music reached a deafening crescendo, a final monstrous clash of sound, and then silence. The music stopped. The fog receded, the dancers froze, and Emma was alone. Chapter 10. The final dance. The silence was deafening. The music had stopped, the fog had receded, and the dancers, those hollow, soulless figures who had moved in eerie synchrony, were now still, their bodies frozen in mid-motion. Emma stood in the center of the clearing, her breath ragged, her heart pounding in her chest, a heavy silence pressing against her ears. For the first time since she had arrived in this twisted world, she was alone. The song that had governed her every move, the pulse that had twisted her mind and body into a puppet, was gone. But something else lingered, a presence. The air around her was thick with it, an unnatural, suffocating weight that made her skin crawl. She could feel it, a dark force closing in on her, like an ancient hand creeping toward her throat. Her body trembled, not from the cold, but from something far deeper, something much darker. The oppressive silence pressed against her, suffocating her from all sides. It was as if the world itself held its breath. Then, from the edge of the clearing, the shadows shifted. A figure emerged, but it was no longer the song and dance man. At least, it wasn't the figure she had seen before. This one was different. His form flickered, shifting in and out of existence, like smoke, like a broken image trying to hold together. The song and dance man had been a conductor, a puppeteer who had orchestrated the dance. But now, he was something else, something darker, something that wasn't bound by the rules of music or the fog or the dance. He was an embodiment of something ancient, something beyond the comprehension of a human mind. He was the source of the music, the song, and the dance. But now, as the song had ended, as the dance had faltered, so too did his power. But even as the music ceased, as the fog thinned and the dancers stopped, Emma realized with growing horror that the song and dance man wasn't leaving. No. He was evolving. He was becoming more. "You shouldn't have done that, Emma." The voice that slithered from the darkness was low, resonating with an unnatural authority. It vibrated in her chest, rattling her bones. It was as though the voice came from the very ground beneath her feet, from the trees that stood silent around her, from the air itself. "You think you can stop it? You think you can undo what was done?" The figure stepped forward, and Emma saw him clearly for the first time. The song and dance man was no longer a man. He was something grotesque, a twisted amalgamation of shadow and form. His body was contorted, limbs bending in unnatural angles, his face obscured by a mask of shifting darkness, like a black void that could swallow a soul. And his eyes were the worst part. They glowed with an otherworldly light, not human, not even alive, but something cold, ancient, and infinitely hungry. Those eyes stared at her, and Emma felt her stomach turn, her pulse quicken, as if he could see straight through her. "This is the end of the dance, Emma, but not the end of the story." The words filled her with dread, but she couldn't move. It was as if her body had frozen of its own accord, held in place by the weight of his gaze. The world around her seemed to tilt, as if she were no longer standing on solid ground. The clearing was fading, blurring, shifting like a dream. The fog rose once again, curling around her feet, engulfing her. The dancers, too, began to move again, slowly at first, their bodies jerking and twitching like marionettes with tangled strings. But as they came closer, their movements grew more fluid, more deliberate. Their faces were still twisted masks of emptiness, but they were now looking directly at her. And it wasn't just Sophie anymore. It was everyone. Everyone who had ever been a part of this endless, cursed dance. Each one of them, eyes hollow and vacant, their bodies a mirror of the torment they had endured. They began to surround her, the music starting once more. This time a haunting, dissonant melody that seemed to cut through the very air, its discordant notes writhing and twisting, like a snake eating its own tail. "You'll dance again, Emma." The song and dance man's voice reverberated in the fog. "The music will never stop. It will never leave you." Emma could feel the pull, the need to move, to follow the rhythm, to surrender to the song. Her feet shifted slightly, her body twitching involuntarily, the beat forcing its way into her every fiber. Her hands twitched, her body slowly swaying as the fog thickened again, swallowing everything else in its path. It was impossible to fight it. The music was everything. The song was her only purpose now. But in the back of her mind, a flicker of defiance remained. She had fought once before, and the song, it had changed. It had faltered. The song and dance man was no longer the master of this place. He was no longer in control. For the first time, Emma could hear it. A subtle shift in the music, a faint melody, so faint it was almost imperceptible, like a whispered note beneath the cacophony. A different song, a different rhythm. She focused, pushing through the fog of confusion, the thundering beats, until she could almost hear it clearly. The music was fighting back. Emma's mind screamed at her to resist, to break free, but her body was no longer hers to command. It was as if the music had taken control of every part of her, her limbs, her heart, her very soul. And yet, the new song, the new rhythm, began to grow louder, clearer. The song and dance man's form flickered, his body twitching in time with the erratic beat of the dance. His gaze, no longer triumphant, shifted, uncertainty creeping into his features. Emma saw it then, for the first time, a crack in his mask, a tiny fracture, just the faintest sliver of light, and with it came the realization that the song and dance man was afraid. He wasn't invincible. "No!" his voice shrieked, a sharp, dissonant screech that tore through the fog. "You cannot break me! You cannot escape!" But Emma wasn't listening anymore. She felt herself rising above the dance, above the music. The shadow that had haunted her was now just that, a shadow. She no longer feared the song. She was no longer part of it. And with that realization came the strength to fight back. She reached deep within herself, searching for something, anything that could break the cycle. And she found it, the silence. The quiet that had once been drowned by the music, the emptiness that she had avoided, was now her only ally. She embraced it, letting it flood her senses, drowning out the discordant melody. And with that silence, the dancers fell still once more. The fog retreated. The song and dance man, he collapsed. The world around Emma shattered like glass, the twisted, warped reality dissolving into nothingness. The music was gone. The fog was gone. The figures were gone. The curse, the dance was over. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emma was truly alone. But in the distance, a single note sounded, a single haunting whisper that slithered into her mind. It was the last note of the song, and it was calling her back.